The courtroom was heavy with an air of quiet authority, the polished wooden benches reflecting the glow of overhead chandeliers. The gavel rested silently on the bench, a symbol of justice that had stood unshaken for centuries. But today, an undercurrent of something unspoken lurked beneath the usual decorum. Judge Malik Carter adjusted his robe, his fingers briefly grazing the gold wedding band on his left hand. It was a grounding habit, something he did whenever he felt the weight of the world pressing too heavily on his shoulders. Today, that weight was more than usual. The morning had started with an unsettling email, a vague but ominous warning that he had chosen to ignore. Judges received threats all the time. It came with the job. Still, there was something different about this one. He glanced up at the rows of spectators. His presence in this position still stirred reactions. Some looked at him with admiration, recognizing the struggles he had overcome to sit on that bench. Others, like the man standing by the prosecution table, Officer Darren McAllister, looked at him with something else entirely. Malik had seen that expression before. It was the kind that did not require words to communicate its message. He was used to it. As one of the youngest judges in the state, and one of the few black men to hold such a position, he had encountered resistance at every step of his career. But something about McAllister's glare sent a chill down his spine. The officer stood rigidly in his neatly pressed uniform, his jaw tight, fists clenched at his sides. He was testifying today in a case that had already drawn media attention. Case where a young black man had been brutally beaten during a routine traffic stop. The defense was arguing excessive force. McAllister was arguing otherwise. Judge Carter cleared his throat, shifting his gaze to the attorneys. The defense lawyer, a woman in a crisp navy suit, shuffled her papers. The prosecutor, a heavy-set man with a gruff voice, leaned back slightly in his chair. It was all standard procedure, and yet, something felt off. "Officer McAllister," Malik said, keeping his voice steady, "please continue with your testimony." McAllister stepped forward, his boots echoing against the marble floor. He placed his hand on the Bible, but there was something almost mechanical about the way he recited his oath. When he finally spoke, his words were clipped, calculated. "The suspect resisted arrest. I used the necessary force to subdue him." Necessary force. Malik had heard those words too many times, often in cases that bore disturbing similarities. He studied McAllister's posture, the way his fingers twitched against his belt, the barely concealed tension in his muscles. According to the footage, Malik said carefully, the suspect was already restrained when additional force was used. "Can you clarify why that was necessary?" McAllister's eyes flickered with something dark, resentment maybe. The air in the room seemed to shift. Even the jury members who had been sitting patiently now sat a little straighter. The spectators murmured quietly. McAllister's lips curled slightly, but it was not a smile. "With all due respect, Your Honor, you were not there." Malik let the words settle before responding. "That is why we rely on evidence, officer." The tension in the room became almost suffocating. Even the court stenographer paused briefly before resuming her swift typing. For a moment, Malik thought the exchange would end there. But then McAllister did something that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He took a step forward. It was not an overtly aggressive move, not something dramatic enough to warrant an immediate reaction. But it was deliberate. It was meant to test boundaries. The bailiff shifted slightly. A few gasps rippled through the audience. Malik held his ground. He had faced worse than intimidation tactics. "I will remind you to remain professional, Officer McAllister." The officer's nostrils flared. His fingers flexed at his sides. Then, in an instant, everything changed. McAllister moved. It happened too fast for most to react. 1 second, he was standing before the bench, and the next, a deafening crash, a collective gasp. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The courtroom fell into stunned silence for a fraction of a second before chaos erupted. Gasps, the screech of chairs dragging against the floor, and the sharp command of the bailiff filled the air. Judge Malik Carter barely had time to react before Officer Darren McAllister's hand slammed down on the bench, his face twisted in unspoken rage. The force of it rattled Malik's gavel, making it roll to the edge of the bench before coming to a stop. The bailiff, a broad-shouldered woman named Lisa Ramirez, was already moving. "Step back, officer." Her voice was sharp, commanding. She had been working security in the courthouse for years and had seen plenty of tense moments, but nothing quite like this. McAllister hesitated, his nostrils flaring, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. For a brief moment, Malik saw something flicker in the man's eyes, something that was not just anger, but something deeper. Resentment. Contempt. Malik forced himself to stay composed, even as adrenaline surged through his veins. He could not afford to lose control. Not here. Not in front of an audience waiting to see how he would respond. He had spent his entire life proving he belonged in this seat, and he would not let this moment undo everything he had built. "Officer McAllister," Malik said, his voice even but firm, "you will step back immediately and remember where you are." McAllister's jaw tensed, but he did not move. The room was suffocating with tension, every eye locked on the unfolding confrontation. It was Ramirez who finally made the decision for him. She stepped between them, her hand hovering near the baton at her waist, her stance tense. "You heard the judge. Step back." This time, McAllister obeyed. He took a slow step away from the bench, his fingers twitching as if resisting the urge to reach for something. Malik exhaled, but the storm inside him did not settle. He had seen officers lose their tempers before, but this felt different. This was personal, and that thought unsettled him more than anything else. That night, Malik sat alone in his study, the dim glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the mahogany desk. A glass of water sat untouched beside an old leather-bound notebook, his father's. He ran his fingers along the worn edges, remembering the late nights he had spent at this very desk as a child, watching his father scribble down notes for his sermons. "Never let them see you break," his father had told him once, his deep voice steady, unwavering. "They will try, son. They will try every way they can. But you hold firm. You remember who you are." Malik had clung to those words through law school, through the endless obstacles thrown in his way, through the days when he had doubted whether the system he fought to uphold was ever meant to protect men like him. And today, those words echoed louder than ever. His phone buzzed, breaking him from his thoughts. It was an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Hello?" A moment of silence. Then, a low, distorted voice crackled through the speaker. "You should have let it go, Judge Carter." His grip tightened around the phone. "Who is this?" A quiet chuckle. Then the line went dead. Malik lowered the phone slowly, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He had received threats before, but something about this one felt different, more direct, more imminent. He reached for his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as he debated his next move. Reporting it was the logical step, but he knew how these things went. Unless there was concrete evidence of immediate danger, nothing would happen. Instead, he pulled up McAllister's personnel file. Years of complaints. Allegations of excessive force. None of them had stuck. Protected. Malik clenched his jaw. The system he had sworn to uphold was the same system that allowed officers like McAllister to operate without consequence. And now that system was warning him to back off. But Malik Carter had never been one to back down. The next morning, Malik walked into the courthouse feeling the weight of unseen eyes on him. As he passed through security, he caught Ramirez's. She gave him a small nod, silent reassurance that she had his back. He appreciated it more than he could say. The day's docket was full, but his mind kept circling back to McAllister. The officer had left the courtroom without another word the day before, but Malik knew this was not over. And he was right. Just before lunch, a court clerk hurried into his chambers, her face pale. "Judge Carter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's someone here to see you," Malik frowned. "Who?" She hesitated. "Officer McAllister." A slow pulse of unease settled in his chest. Did he say why? No, sir. Just that it's important. Malik took a steadying breath before nodding. Send him in. The door opened, and McAllister stepped inside. Today, he was not in uniform, just a plain button-down and dark jeans. He shut the door behind him, his posture stiff. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, McAllister exhaled sharply. You do not know what you are getting yourself into, Judge. Malik leaned back in his chair, studying him. Is that a threat? McAllister shook his head, something unreadable flickering across his expression. No, it is a warning. Malik let that hang between them for a moment. Then start talking. McAllister hesitated, his jaw working as if debating how much to say. They do not want you digging, he finally muttered. That case, the one you are presiding over, it is bigger than you think. Malik narrowed his eyes. Who is they? McAllister exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I have already said too much. He turned toward the door. Malik's voice stopped him. You think I am scared of them? McAllister turned back, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that almost resembled concern. You should be. Then he was gone, leaving Malik with more questions than answers, and a chilling certainty that whatever he had stepped into was only just beginning.